Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the second day of the Daksha Conclave. The conclave is an effort to bring together the leaders from academia, practice, and industry to put our heads together on the most contemporary problems that we face in the world of law and policy. And the second day today, first panel that we have is on the IBC and cross-border insolvency. We have with us a very eminent panelist. To give a short background, the IDC was a big step forward in India. It really consolidated the law relating to insolvency and the management of that. But then there's one crucial area that has been left out, that is cross-border insolvency. And in the globalizing world that we are in, it's a question whether we can afford to keep that out of the scope of the formal process of the law to this extent. We have some model laws that the UNCITRAL has come out with, but we are yet to engage with it in deeper terms. And the purpose of today's panel is to reflect on what should be the law and the policy framework that India should adopt in dealing with this problem. And for this, we have a very eminent panel, and it's my privilege to welcome Aparna Ravi to moderate this session. Aparna is a lawyer with more than a decade of experience, and she started her professional career in New York and London. She primarily works on banking and finance, insolvency, private law, private equity, and venture capital investments. Apart from her interest in practice, she's also very keen in policy. She was a member of the Bankruptcy Law Reform Committee. And prior to moving back to India, she worked as an in-house counsel at Credit Suisse, where she supported investment banking department on equity-linked and high-yield transactions. Thank you, Aparna, for taking time out to attend this session. I will hand over the session to you. You can introduce the other panelists and take the session forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Menon. I hope I'm audible, and good morning to everybody. And I'd like to thank Sai University and the Daksha Fellows for inviting me to moderate this very distinguished panel today. I would first like to introduce the three eminent speakers we have for today's panel, and then I'll introduce the topics briefly and then hand it over to each of the speakers to take it forward. So the first speaker, who needs no introduction at all, but I will nevertheless go on to introduce him, is Mr. Amarjit Singh Chandiok. Mr. Chandiok is a distinguished senior advocate practicing in the Supreme Court and High Courts in India. He was president of the Delhi High Court Bar Association for 6 terms, which is a record. A former Additional Solicitor General of India, he was also Principal Counsel to the European Union Commission from August 2013 to March 2016. Mr. Chandiok is also President of Madhyam Council for Conflict Resolution, a professional organization aiming for excellence in the development of law and conflict resolution. He's also Vice Chairman of the Society of Insolvency Practitioners of India, and a member of the Advisory Committee of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. Mr. Chandiok has been conferred many prestigious awards, including Outstanding Jurist 2000 and the National Law Day Award 2006 from the then Prime Minister of India, Dr. Manmohan Singh, for his contribution in the practice of civil law. He is also awarded 2 doctorates, and he's, as we all know, extremely active in the insolvency law space in terms of practice as well as policy. So very warm welcome to you, sir, Mr. Chandiok. The second speaker is Mr. Alipak Banerjee, who is a leader in the International Dispute Resolution and Investigations practice at Nishit Desai Associates. Alipak holds a bachelor's degree in law and a master's degree in international commercial laws from University College London. And prior to joining Nishit Desai, he worked with Professor Martin Hunter at the Essex Court Chambers in London. His practice includes representing clients in institutional and ad hoc arbitrations and litigation proceedings in various jurisdictions, including India, Singapore, Hong Kong, and London. And he has advised and represented clients engaged in media, entertainment, oil and gas, energy, manufacturing, and other areas, to name a few. So very warm welcome to you, Alitak. The third speaker is Mr. Sudeep Mahapatra, who is currently a partner at SNR Associates in New Delhi. Sudeep represents clients in a wide variety of complex business transactions, including domestic and international mergers and acquisitions, growth capital investments, buyouts, and joint ventures. Prior to joining SNR Associates, he previously worked at Kirkland and Ellis in New York. So very warm welcome to you as well, Sudeep. So in terms of today, as we all know, the IBC has been in effect since December 2016, has been heralded as a game-changing legislation in many ways, one of the most significant economic reforms next only in the last few years, next only to the GST. In providing a consolidated law to deal with insolvency resolution and liquidation in a time-bound manner, it has really transformed the debtor-creditor relationship, improved recovery, and also led to, importantly, to a number of resolutions, which has been able to provide a new lease of life to many companies. At the same time, of course, the last 4 years has not been smooth sailing for the IBC. There have been lots of challenges to implementation on the ground. There's also been a lot of litigation around it. And in response to this, there have also been a lot of amendments and changes that have gone along the way. This is something that is to be expected in any new legislation, particularly an economic legislation which has the scope and impact of something like the IBC. So it is very much something where, as we get more and more evidence on how the law is evolving and working on the ground, that it's expected that there will be various changes going forward. And so the law that actually started out, it has changed in very interesting ways, both through judicial decisions as well as through the legislative process itself. In today's session, we are actually going to be looking at some areas of insolvency law that are not specifically provided for in the code, but are important emerging areas. The first of these is cross-border insolvency. And this is something that is in a related area that's closely related to this is the insolvency of enterprise groups. Because once you start thinking of cross-border insolvency, you'll also have to look at the fact that it may not be the same legal entity across different areas. And the third area, which is also very interesting and is an emerging area of which there was very recently a subcommittee report on this process, is pre-PACs. So each of the speakers today is going to spend about 20 minutes discussing each of these different areas, and then there will be some time for discussion and reactions among the speakers before we turn it over to the student presentation from the Daksha Fellows. In terms of these three areas, one thing that I did mention is that they're all not dealt with in the legislation. And they don't actually, there isn't a full-fledged legal framework to deal with these areas as of now. The other point, though, is that despite that, the market, of course, does not wait for the law to develop in a particular area. So we have already seen instances of cross-border insolvency coming up in various cases. I think the most high profile of these is Jet Airways, but there are many others as well where cross-border elements come in. And similarly, we've also seen what happens when there are insolvencies of various companies that are part of the same group. And while they may be separate legal entities, they have enough overlap that in some situations, consolidating the proceedings may make more sense. And this is something we've seen in the Videocon insolvency proceedings. While pre-PACs, perhaps we haven't seen it in that specific context, it is something that, when you think about the sort of spectrum between out-of-court settlements and, the formal insolvency process, we do see that there is, it's a kind of a continuum in which pre-PACs again is the next logical step. So that is what unites these different emerging issues today. And I would like to turn it over to our first speaker, Mr. Chandyok, to tell us a little bit about cross-border insolvency as well as group insolvency. So, Mr. Chandyok, if you could speak up, we'd request you to speak about what happens in when there are no specific cross-border laws in India. There is a little bit in the IBC, but not to the extent of adopting something like the UNCITRAL model law. So, in that context, if you could tell us a little bit about what are the judicial principles that have been developed in this context. And then you can also go on to speak about the intersection of cross-border insolvency with the insolvency of enterprise groups and your views in terms of the kind of principles that should be in place to enable different kinds of group insolvency, whether it's procedural or substantive. So just before I turn it over to you to give people a very brief background of cross-border insolvency itself, it comes up in three different contexts, right? I mean, very broad contexts, which are all very prevalent in the global economy and in most economic transactions today. So one is, of course, where the corporate debtor has assets in outside India, basically in another jurisdiction. Another is where there are foreign creditors who are interested in protecting their recoveries and their interests. And lastly, there's also a situation where there could be proceedings in more than one jurisdiction, insolvency proceedings against the same debtor in more than one jurisdiction. So in all these contexts, cross-border insolvency becomes very relevant. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Chandyok for to speak about cross-border insolvency. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Aparna. Good morning to everybody. Good morning to the organizers, and thank them from the core of my heart that you called upon me to be part of this session. Well, the introduction itself, Aparna, has answered many questions already. So really speaking, it leaves me a field to only explain the situation. And before I go to the cross-border concept, let me first of all place it with sense of pride that I think this is one economic legislation right from the time that Mr. Vishwanathan put that report in place, which was also a time-long report that we saw coming in place with the draft legislation. The parliament took upon itself to go ahead with the legislation in a faster movement by way of velocity. And then every stakeholder, we had great apprehensions that there's no profession called resolution professional. Where are we going to get all these people from? But over this span of some time that we have only spent about 4 years, we find there is a resolution professionals have done a commendable job. Not only that, the NCLTs, many people thought that from Companies Act, going straight away to an insolvency, which was not a concept known. I mean, of course, we had those 1920 British Acts with us on insolvency, or we had Companies Act 1956, where winding up was the only thing. The reconstruction of a company or bringing it back to the society or to the economic field was not there in our law. We introduced that for the first time, and I just wanted to tell my dear audience that Insol India, which is part of Insol International, we started these principles of insolvency way back 21 years ago, with the first president as Justice Manmohan Singh, who retired as a Chief Justice of J&K, followed by Justice Sikri, and the last honorable judge who was there was the present judge of the Supreme Court, Justice Sanjay Kishan Kaul, from where I took over as the president of the Insol India. But that's different. What I'm only saying is that we still talked about it. We went around, not only in India, we went even up to Ceylon to talk about what should be the principles of insolvency. So during the time that we had no law of insolvency, we were still looking at it from a point of how do we bring about a settlement between the parties to see if we can bring the company back into the play. But yes, the concept of insolvency that we have now brought in 2016 was not there at all in the law. Yet the courts evolved principles, how do we do it? There could be merger, amalgamation, settlement with class of creditors, etc., was there. So This legislation is the only legislation, to my little knowledge, that has undergone changes with times and won the award as the one of the best jurisdictions in the world, beating Singapore also in way back in 2018. So therefore, we have done a commendable job with respect to that. Yes, every law has to evolve. Coming to the query that Aparna has raised for me, you see, when you see, I'm just giving an example, Article 21 in the Constitution, which is the basic structure of our fundamental rights, we only thought it was right, which we expanded by judicial pronouncement. Right to live with dignity, right to life, right to, and we went on expanding it from one case to the other, and we have brought that one sentence of Article 21 into a new dimension altogether. Therefore, it will depend upon the facts of the case, of course, but it will also depend upon what principles can we draw from other jurisdictions. In fact, nothing is preventing a court to, or the tribunal to look at the UNCITRAL model law and look at those principles and apply them in a given facts of the case. In fact, what we did, as Aparna rightly mentioned, in Jet Airways, we recognized and we brought the administrator from abroad as part of the committee of creditors here. And that's where we were able to bring some kind of a semblance between the insolvency proceedings going on there and there. The purpose is what? The underlying principle is, and that's on the fundamental principle in common law. You have 4 cases going on in simultaneously 4 jurisdictions within the country. So you're always scared one court may not give judgment inconsistent with the other. So the consistency of the judgment, consistency of the principles of law, so conflict of decisions is first principle of cross-border, to see how do we bring all that into one field and see there is no inconsistency between one court to the other. We have UNCITRAL model law, and our experience shows, take for example, the New York Convention. We take for example, the arbitration. We have not adopted model law exactly. Our Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996 is based on that, is fine, but it doesn't carbon copy from model law. We have made many amendments which are not there in the. Therefore, the model law will give, UNCITRAL model law will give us a light, show us a path, lay down something for us to look at, but we will have to modify it. India is specifically different. We have different cultures. We have different way of working. Here, many of our industries are working from probably great-grandfathers to something, the family companies. We'll have to look at them into that context, that what is the cultural requirement of that. And I only wanted to bring home that the preamble of the code tells us that it is meant for bringing the company or the corporate debtor back into the economic activity of the country. And that's why it says maximization of the assets. So even the cross-border, we'll have to look at it. That if it is better, and if the main business of that corporate debtor is, say, in Dubai or in UK or in USA, then we'll have to give way to that main interest there to see where they are. The problems that we are facing inter alia are that an Indian creditor has a debtor whose assets are abroad. Now, that's where the whole problem is lying. How do I make that order passed into Section 14, for example, make applicable to Singapore or somewhere else? But yes, courts have now looked at it. And if you see the Supreme Court judge who raised this issue in an insolvency, I think 5 years ago at Singapore, saying that we should have convention within the judges, nothing to do with us as professionals or as RPs. So a judge speaks to the other judge in another jurisdiction where another matter is going on pertaining to the same corporate debtor. So they talk to each other. They probably there have been times when we have seen sessions going on together, so that one judge does not go inconsistent with another judge. That's the fundamental principle of law, whether we have an insolvency cross-border with us or we do not have it. We find on the draft that we are looking at it, there are many things, many comments have come with respect to the same, because economic situation is changing today. Every day there's an economic change, and that's witnessed by the factum of that the insolvency code itself has been amended by the parliament, by ordinance and otherwise, 4-5 times. And I think every week or every month, no month passes before IBBI comes and gives us new regulation or amendment to the regulation, because this is a changing scenario. We learn from every day. Every pronouncement, and we must give credit to our judicial system, though a lot of times I see people criticizing, but I still feel We have done a commendable job right up to the Supreme Court. I do not think any law has taken this evolution with that velocity. The Supreme Court has given us decision after decision, ironed out. Many people say, look, there is a timeline given in the IBC, but there's no timeline for the decision. That's fine. But please consider, if you add that decision in the principle that the decision has laid down, it has helped down maybe 200 cases down the line. So please add that time for that. And if you add that time that you're saved in that, then it will be well within the timelines that we look at it. And every new thing that we saw, I think those 12 cases that came for the first instance gave us the instances. We still have a matter pending. Out of those, where we are looking at is if there is a fraudulent transaction between the corporate debtor and his subsidiary, which is outside, and the assets are lying, can it be still brought back to the picture for the benefit of the financial creditors? Now, these are issues that will arise in facts of every case. But the fundamental principle, though we had Section 234 in the code, but it was not possible. And I think rightly so, the government did not attempt. Because to make a treaty, first of all, requires a lot of effort, a lot of discussion, a lot of going up and down, and then getting ratified from one parliament and the other. Then implementation itself takes a lot of time. Therefore, I think it's time. And if you see the report which was given by Vishwanathan Saab, he in fact said that we were confronted with this situation, that whether we should have cross-border itself right in the beginning or not. And we decided against it because we wanted to bring legislation faster and it was taking little time. But as we have now grown, we are a child now, 4-year-old, we have now understood principles of insolvency. Let's be, with all humility at my command, many of us did not know, and I still feel we don't know. Because I am looking at a day in an insolvency resolution plan where resolution plan of Aparna gives more amount, excuse my saying so, Aparna, and my plan gives lesser amount in terms of cash to the financial creditors or the operational creditors. But you feel, no, I have with me Mr. Banerjee, I have with Mr. Mahapatra, who are experts in the field in which that industry is. And they have the habit, they have the culture, they have the capacity to turn around that industry back into the fore. And I'm sure a day will come when this will prevail over the cash that you're giving to the financial creditors. That's the actual situation of maximization of the asset. That's the actual aim of the act. It is when we keep on saying, I have recovered from 42% to 45%, I don't think recovery is a criteria in an IBC. Recovery is not the criteria. I may not recover anything, but if I have brought, look at this, I'm just giving, take any industry today. Steel industry, it takes about 12 years to establish a steel industry. And a resolution applicant is going to get it in the timelines given under the IBC. A ready-made situation. The purpose is this only, that here is a new management with new skill, new innovation, so that that industry who will probably cater to 10,000 or 5,000 employees, their families. And in fact, the latest part you will see, I think it's worth mentioning to all of you. When we were doing 2G case, I was representing the government. And when we almost understood that the court feels that these licenses were not given correctly. So I stood up and said, we have standing counsels in the Supreme Court for every state. Please consider one thing, and which statement has now come from the Prime Minister, I think 2 days ago or yesterday maybe, that even your dhobi, even your person in your chaprasi or a peon has got a mobile in his hand. That exactly was my argument, that please look at these people who have established right from scratch and reached this mobile industry to a particular place. Ask each state, what do they need? Somebody may need university, somebody may need, nobody knew that COVID is going to come. Somebody may need hospital, somebody may need something else. Please ask these people to make a corpus, give that corpus to that state to establish that university or hospital. And the government must bring experts for 2 years or 5 years, depending upon the status. Then ask that state to take over. So you will do a public good without destroying the basic structure of these licenses. Of course, it didn't prevail with the court. I must accept that part. But today the government feels, yes, that was the way out. Therefore, the question is, today we have done wonders with respect to all this. The principle that we have brought about, who knew that order would come in Jet Airways where a foreign administrator would be recognized and come as, and we made a history all over. Everybody thought, wow, what are the principles that we have got? So this is now today with, I appreciate the matter is coming up. It is drawing the attention of everybody. All experts are looking at it. They are giving their comments to the government. I'm sure, in fact, I was expecting that pre-pack as well as this will probably come with an ordinance, but maybe it may not come with an ordinance. Maybe the next session of the parliament may bring it into it, or maybe even still now it can come with an ordinance. Because today there's a need, especially after pandemic. There are cross-border issues that are rising in courts, and they need a guideline and statutory guideline. You see, there's one thing to say a judicial principle is evolved by me over the time, but it's another thing that I have a judicial backing. It may be possible that the judicial statutory provision is not up to mark. The court may interpret it and make it into wide resolution, as I gave you definition of Article 21. But then, if there's no guideline, then there may be no consistency in the system. Therefore, each judge may go one principle or the other. We may have conflicting, and ultimately we'll go to Supreme Court, and which may take us again some time. Therefore, that's the need. We have a foundation of UNCITRAL. We have a foundation where we are looking at it. Now, we have already announced Part 3 made applicable today. So why are we not looking at cross-border, even with respect to individuals or partnerships and LLPs? It's another question that we need to address ourselves. That while we are bringing a cross-border provisions, please make it applicable to everybody. Because it will be possible that I am an individual who's coming in the bankruptcy proceeding, but my assets may be lying in London. And we have instances now where I think my two friends, two eminent people who are with me on the panel, and Aparna will bear me out. My experience has been, in order to reach the actual person, you have to go through 10 layers. One to the subsidiary is the 100% subsidiary, then that subsidiary invests into 4 other subsidiaries. It goes on and on. And many times you wonder that who was making actually the investment? Somebody is routing his money through Mauritius, somebody is losing his money through Ireland, somebody is routing his money through somebody else. That's what is happening. So therefore, it is need, is necessity. It's imperative today, to my mind, that we should bring a cross-border proposition into it. But till such time, as Aparna said, the principles need to be evolved. And I think it's time that the Supreme Court, in some decision or the other. In fact, it reminds me, I see a decision when probably Justice Sikri was about to demit office. The subject matter was a dispute between parties. But he took that opportunity to say it's time for us to look at legislation on mediation. So he made that recommendation into that judgment, though the dispute was with respect to something else. But he thought such disputes can also go into it. And I'm not only looking at this, I'm looking mediation as a big thing, especially after India has signed Singapore Convention. Why can't it be a part of cross-border situation? Why can't it be a part of a pre-pack? Why can't it be a part of the insolvency itself? And I think time that I was a part of that committee which recommended a legislation on mediation. If that is accepted, we have said there shall be no action, including an action under Section 7 or 9 or 10 of the IBC, till you have a round of mediation and everybody at least sits for 2 rounds to see, because then you'll be able to understand what is the underlying interest of everybody. If the interest is only to recover, then there are so many ways to recover. Because if the interest is not to put that industry, and what is the pre-pack situation, though my friends will elaborate on it, I'm sure, my jurisdiction is limited to something else. But having said that, our purpose is this only, because the person who has established the industry knows the best bet out of it. He knows nitty-gritty so well, he'll be able to look at it, he will tell you these are the areas where he needs help from. Therefore, the pre-pack would be an ideal situation. I do not know whether they'll amend Section 29A with respect to that or not, is another question. Even with respect to cross-border, look at our case that every day we find, when is our great tycoon going to come back to India? Kingfisher. Everybody is talking about it. But if the man was offering me 4,000 crores, why did I not take it? I can still hang him for the offenses if he has done. Nobody stops us. A criminal law will not stop. Now, here was a situation where there is a cross-border element because he had assets elsewhere. He had companies elsewhere. We could have evolved a principle through a system of NCLT or the adjudicating authority and brought everything down. He was offering something, we could have asked a resolution applicant to take over something. But then we didn't do it. And what could be a better principle of all this? As we see Satyam, for example, when the government intervened and see, we are back in place. Now, these are instances that we need to learn to adopt. Now, the group insolvency, the first step we had to take with respect to the case my friend has referred to, that we thought there will be conflict. One was in A jurisdiction, B was in second jurisdiction. So we moved then the president of the NCLT to say, we should all be at one place at least do that first. And now we have brought a concept that in one case, there can be more than one resolution plan. Now, if there can be more than one resolution plan, then why can't in a cross group company or an entity having subsidiaries, etc., why can't we have more than one resolution plans? So that will be another principle that we need to develop. And I have no hesitation in accepting that we need to learn every day's experience, both as professionals and also as our judges who are imparting that position. Because till we are able to make innovative situations, we will not be able to do it. And I think time has come when we stop looking at SEC online or something and say, look, there's judge in Karnataka said this and Chennai said this and here said this. Time has come when we professionals will have to look at it from the point of view to give something totally innovative. Looking at the international principles, we have large insolvency proceedings in US, UK, Europe. We can draw those principles. We have, many people feel that where's the recognition? In India, there's a recognition. Certainly, foreign judgment can be enforced subject to the conditions that are laid down in Code of Civil Procedure. I can use that for the time being, expand that scope to say, this is not a civil suit. You're not coming for a decree to be executed, which should be strictly in terms of Section 2 of the Code of Civil Procedure. This is an insolvency. We are looking at how do you bring the corporate entity back in for the economic use of the nation. And therefore, you may draw a new principle to say, even if because many times, many people don't go abroad only for the reason that he can't bear the cost. All three probably have been abroad, so they all know what is the cost exorbitant is part of that. In India, we don't have it. We started looking at it now. In fact, Section 35 has been amended under the Commercial Codes Act to bring cost to the picture. So that will be one part that we'll look at. But we have, and this rubber stamping by adjudicating authority only because committee of creditors have sat down and do it, I think we also need to mend ways. There could be possibilities that a committee of creditors may be looking at zone recovery. It may not be looking at the industry as such to see how will the new professional work at. We are talking about clean slate principle, but many times clean slate, there are so many things which have nothing happened. And I'll give you a very small example. This happened last week. A company is already with the resolution applicant. He's now the corporate debtor. And now a notice has come from the Municipal Corporation of Delhi saying, are you structurally fit to run this industry? Now the man is running from good fort to fort. What is the structurally wrong? Nobody pointed out that there's something wrong with the structure at all. So you have to close the industry to first look at structural engineer, to first give a certificate to the corporation, otherwise they won't renew his licenses. Now, these are factors that we need to correct. These are factors that we must bring in the jurisdiction of the insolvency, and these principles will be well applicable in cross-border. Extremely well applicable. In fact, you see arbitration, for example, we have almost, there is a Geneva Convention written in the Act, but hardly there's any award. Mr. Banerjee will correct me on that. I hardly find any award coming in the Geneva. Everything is in the New York Convention. And every day we are adding countries to it. When we went for the signing of the Singapore Convention, nobody knew so many countries will sign it. But yes, that's the way global economies are working. And I think time has come when we need to look at the statutory provision first, how UNCITRAL model law would become applicable. How will that protocol work in my country, especially in relation to when the industry's main business is outside the country. You have something here, or the vice versa. You have a main here, but the assets are lying somewhere else. Now, these are broad principles that the court must lay down, and we must assist the court. And I can assure you time is coming We are doing that. We have in fact worked on it to say that the only question again arises for us is we have not allowed foreign lawyers to come to this country. The bar stands up like us, Bar Council of India, Bar Associations, everybody. In fact, I can confess that I was the one who had also said that, and I still say that, the talent available in this country is nowhere in the world. Nowhere. The way an Indian lawyer thinks is nowhere. And my youngsters must understand, you are the future. You will give us something better than what we have given to our generation. So I don't find any reason. But yes, but in the changed circumstances, you will have to look at a restrictive permission for a person to come and participate. Because unless you allow that permission, it won't be easier for you to have the only problem is reciprocity for India. In fact, in foreign lawyers' position is also the same problem. They are not ready to give me reciprocity. In India, we have almost 22 universities, degrees are recognized in India, but there's nobody, not a single university is recognized in UK or United States. So that's the problem today the world is facing. We are looking at those problems that we need to address. And on a broader perspective, I think time has come and it's need of the hour that a cross-border principle must be evolved, because there's so much going on all the world. Today, we are having shares going from here to there. We can buy from X, Y to the Z. There are assets that we can create in foreign worlds. I mean, I as an individual can send money abroad every year, maybe to a particular extent, but that will also be an asset somewhere. And supposing I have a insolvency, bankruptcy against me, what will happen to that resolution professional? He will not have access to that. Therefore, these are fundamental principles that I think we should evolve if the legislation is taking time. But yes, I reiterate that legislation would give us something that is in need of the hour, at least principle. No legislation is perfect. No legislation. It needs change, and especially in economic legislation, it needs change. We have developed now new Specific Relief Act. We have developed new Contract Act. We have developed all those amendments. Similarly, we will have to do this, but at least we must do away with 234 and bring that maybe UNCITRAL role model laws. Based on UNCITRAL role model laws, there's a need that we must cross-border situation. On a group insolvency, I think for the present, the NCLT or the adjudicating authority would be well advised to at least club them together, get resolution plans of everyone together, see what has an impact interrelation between one and two. I mean, I need not even name the case. We know that. We have seen a manufacturing unit was A, selling unit was B. Now, unless we have a resolution plan for both, how will we do it? Our entire thing that was being manufactured was to be taken over by another company, which is also a subsidiary. Therefore, unless I bring resolution plan for both, I will not be able to succeed. It may not be able to do it in the market so well. And to end my 20 minutes, I'm sure I'm exceeded it. I want to give you an example on a lighter vein and leave. I had a mediation before me where a person Levi's jeans were counterfeited. So we were in IP. Matter came. So in the caucus in the session, I asked this gentleman, how otherwise is the quality of this gentleman, of the jeans that he's producing? He says, I must confess, is much better than my own. Now see what we evolved. What would you call it in IBC? I'm intentionally giving this example. We agreed, the settlement that we arrived at was, this man will only manufacture for Levi's. So Levi's, in its own standard of product went up in the market. Now that is really the economic law. That's really the means of IBC. That's really how we should look at our resolution applicants. That's really we should evolve situations, whether it's cross-border, whether it's national, international, whatever we want to do. Therefore, it's a great opportunity. I'll have the benefit of hearing my friends who would probably throw more light than I could even do that. And thank you so much, Aparna, for this opportunity. I'll be here for your question answers.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chandu, for very insightful remarks, both generally on the overall purpose of the code itself as we are envisioning it. I think that was very insightful. And also, I think just moving forward with this, I think one of the main things that you really emphasized was that for cross-border insolvency, the importance is around consistency of judgments. And while something like the Jet Airways case is really heralded as an area where there was innovation and protocols were developed between the Dutch administrator and the Indian parties, this may not, how do we ensure? We probably need a statutory framework to ensure that this is consistently applied across a lot of other cases, which may also have cross-border elements, but may not have involved such the specific kinds of stakeholders or be as high profile to attract that kind of attention. So I'll turn it over now to the next speaker, Alipak, to talk about the principles of the UNCITRAL model law. Maybe first, what currently, as you mentioned, Section 234 and what the IBC, the minimal provisions in the IBC on cross-border insolvency, and what the model law can bring in. And also, it will be very interesting to hear from you on the interface between cross-border insolvency and arbitration, which I think is also an area of your expertise. So I'll turn it over to you now, Alipak. Thank you so much, Mr. Chandu.
Thank you so much, Aparna. Thank you, the organizers, for having me speak on this panel. As you and Chandyok sir has set the tone, I propose to sort of briefly touch upon the provisions of IBC, which cater to cross-border insolvency, with the caveat that these two provisions have not been notified. And then I propose to briefly deal with the UNCITRAL model law, and also the committee recommendation. I mean, in 2018, the Insolvency Committee had set out certain recommendation to sort of tweak the UNCITRAL model law and how it can be applied in the Indian context. Of course, that has not seen the light of the day, but it will be interesting to look at that. Subsequently, I intend to also speak on a topic of my specific interest, the intersection of arbitration and insolvency, and to put it in the context of today's discussion, cross-border insolvency. There's a lot of work going on in this space. As I know, I mean, the IBA is preparing a detailed report with 23 jurisdictions, and that is set to be released in March. So a lot of jurisprudence is on its way. But let me briefly make an attempt to touch on some of the issues. I'm conscious of my time that has been allotted to me, and I'll try my best to stick to that. Now, briefly, under the Insolvency Code, as some of the as many of us know, there are two sections which have been incorporated, Section 234 and 235. In the code, which sort of contemplates cross-border insolvency and how they ought to be recognized. Now, these two sections are very different. Well, the first one is more of a general section, Section 234, which simply stipulates the manner in which there could be a reciprocal arrangement between India and the others, similar to what we have under Section 44 of the Arbitration Act, and Section 44 of the CPC, the reciprocal arrangement with other countries. This provision can only be applied, I mean, if India was to enter into bilateral agreements with other sovereign states. That has not happened. This provision has not been notified. And thereafter, there could be, I think the thought process was, after entering into the agreement, the further stipulations would have been prescribed as to how the modalities would work. The second provision, to my mind, is slightly more nuanced. Section 235, it contemplates a letter of request. This is typically, this provision, to my mind, was incorporated to look at a case-to-case basis, where if in a particular case an application was made to NCLT upon permission or upon approval of the NCLT, the foreign the relevant authority in the foreign country or the foreign jurisdiction could have been approached to assist in that case. Like, for example, if there's a corporate debtor in India with foreign assets in Singapore, under 235, on that specific case, if the assets are over there, a similar request under 235 could have been made to the foreign regulator, to the foreign authority, and that would have helped in sort of resolving the cross-border angle to it. Again, this has not been notified, as Chandyok sir was has rightly pointed out, these are the two sections which typically, in my view, does not fit in the answer trial model law, which sort of looks at a wider picture. I think maybe these two provisions will be scrapped and we will have an entire new chapter, maybe under the code, which will contemplate the nuances. Now, yes, I will. There have been 2 or 3 cases on cross-border insolvency in India. Just to name, Jet Airways is the most prominent one. Yes, there was also a cross-border angle in the Videocon Industries case as well. And there's also another case where in the US, where a Delaware court acknowledged the NCLT Chandigarh order as the main proceedings. That case is also very interesting. So I'll touch upon them in a minute. Now, briefly, to discuss the answer trial model law. So unlike the arbitration the model law 1985, this is not so popular. Only about 44 countries have accepted it. It came into being in 1987. Countries like UK, US, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, they are all parties to it. Unlike a regular convention, this if one was to be a signatory to answer trial model on cross-border insolvency, I mean, you do not typically have to enact an entire code under your obligation under 253 of the Constitution, like one would do for, like Chandyok sir was saying, for mediation. The code, the answer trial model law is slightly nuanced than that. It is more of a guide, and it is up to you what you want to pick and choose and make it applicable in your domestic context. Which is to say that it does not prescribe a mandatory unification of the substantive domestic laws. It proposes broadly 4 elements, and they are access, recognition, relief, and cooperation. I mean, these are also there in the Arbitration Act. Just to do a comparative analysis, I mean, if one sees the provisions of Arbitration Act under section 47, 48, and 49, first there is access, then there is recognition, and there is enforcement. Similarly, in this model code, it has been spread under 4 different heads. It recognizes 2 main categories of proceedings. One is the foreign main proceedings and foreign non-main proceedings. I'll come to each of the definitions in a minute. By foreign main proceedings, one can understand where the corporate debtor has a center of its main interest. This is a hugely debated concept in international law. A lot of states have had reservations on this. They have had, while enacting the cross-border legislation, they have had their own inputs. But yes, the code has its own way. I mean, it prescribes that there should be 2 broad concepts, and then one is your main proceedings, and anything which is not main is your non-main proceedings. That's how the court goes about it. Foreign non-main proceedings would include where the corporate debtor has an establishment, and an establishment would be in place of operations where the debtor carries out non-transitory economic activity with human means and goods or services. Now, again, each of these terms can be subject to a lot of debate and interpretation. I'm sure when we have the law, there will be sufficient explanation and guidance on how we want this to be implemented in our context. Now, other than answer trial model law, there are also mechanisms all over the world. Like, for example, the European Union, they have EC regulation on insolvency proceedings. The Singapore has a model law. These are also guidelines which are there in the world. While enacting the law, I'm sure we will look at them as well. And as Chandyok sir was saying, I mean, people have commented. I think the reason why things may not have moved since 2018 is maybe perhaps because this is a very complicated question, and maybe we want to do our best in putting together the best practices, which is why it is getting delayed. But that my point is to say that there is guidance over and above the answer trial model as well. Now let's quickly look at what were the committee recommendations in 2018. The report came in on 16th of October 2018, and it is still at the recommendation stage. Again, for proceedings commenced outside India, it prescribes a detailed reciprocity requirement. the committee recommended that the applicability would extend only to foreign countries who have adopted model law into the domestic regimes, and these countries would be notified by the central government, like it has been done under the Arbitration Act. Like, just to put a context, like for example, the New York Convention, which Chandyok sir was referring, it has been signed by 149 countries, but India has reciprocal arrangement under the Arbitration Act only with 49 countries, 48 countries. So one is to suggest that the one is to look at that which are the countries which have signed the model law, but that is the first threshold. The second threshold, of course, would be the bilateral agreement which India would have with this other sovereign state, and maybe the reciprocal arrangement that we are discussing, that would only apply to this limited countries. So that's the second threshold. uh, and now the proposal, I mean, that is largely borrowed from the model law. I mean, it contemplates that a foreign representative can apply to NCLT for recognition of a foreign proceeding. Upon recognition, the foreign representative can participate in the corporate insolvency resolution process. And the definition of foreign representative has also been kept a little wide. It would include a person or a body who has been authorized in a foreign proceedings to manage the insolvency resolution process. There are also provisions that in case the foreign representatives violate any of the draft provisions, then the insolvency board, they can impose a penalty. It also talks about what is the center of main interest, which I briefly touched upon earlier, and it sets out certain criteria. The general presumption would be where the registered office is, unless the registered office has changed within 3 months prior to the initiation of the insolvency. The NCLT has also been empowered to sort of to look at and determine whether corporate debtors central administration takes place, and whether such location is readily ascertainable by third parties. And of course, I mean, the recommendation provides a wide sort of power on NCLT to look at a case-to-case basis, because there can't be, I mean, each case will be different to that extent. On foreign non-main proceedings, I mean, they have said that it can commence in any jurisdiction where the corporate debtor has an establishment. It is a proceeding which is other than foreign main proceedings where the corporate debtor has an establishment. They have created an exception for public policy, but they have not defined it. Of course, public policy, as we know, has been up for a lot of debate in last 20 years in the context of Arbitration Act. Even in Vijay Karya, the case which was decided earlier in 2020, and several other cases, the debate continues as to what would infringe public policy. Well, there is guidance. I mean, we have to see when the legislation comes how they define it. But fundamental notions of Indian law, Justice Nariman has set out so many judgments. Then there are new concepts as to if it infringes any substantive law of the country of India, does it amount to breach of public policy? At least in the context of FEMA, the Delhi High Court and even Supreme Court, they have said may not be. I mean, the test of public policy has to be something much broader than that. It has to infringe the fundamental policy on which the laws are set out in India. So we'll have to see how this gets defined. Now let's come back to the two cases that we have. And I intend to touch upon Jet Airways, since that is the real case where we agreed to sort of an ad hoc mechanism with the Dutch administrator. So in this case, a Jet Airways aircraft was grounded in Amsterdam over non-payment of dues to a European cargo firm. Insolvency proceedings were initiated in Netherlands, and an administrator was appointed. Simultaneously, even in India, IBC proceedings were initiated. Even this was pending. Now, the Dutch administrator made an application before NCLT Mumbai seeking an intervention. Now, that was rejected. And I can quote from the NCLT Mumbai's judgment. They said that there's no provision and mechanism in the insolvency code at this moment to recognize the judgment of an insolvency court of any foreign nation. Thus, even if the judgment of foreign judgment is verified and found to be true, the relevant provisions of IBC, we cannot take this order. Now, this was reversed on appeal by the NCLAT, NCLAT allowed the Dutch administrator and the resolution professional in India to agree upon a cross-border insolvency protocol where India was recognized as the center of main interest and the Dutch proceedings as non-main insolvency proceedings. Through this protocol, the resolution professional and the Dutch administrator agreed on terms and conditions on which they would extend cooperation in the insolvency process. The Dutch administrator was allowed to be allowed to be an observer in the proceedings of Committee of Creditors, but they had the right to attend, but of course they did not have the right to vote. So this was the Jet Airways case. This is still ongoing. Thereafter, we had Videocon case where the NCLT, although they allowed Videocon to sort of extend, since the asset pool, substantial asset pool was outside India. This is one of the few cases where the asset pool was extended to outside India, although there is no cross-border mechanism. Again, this is also a sub judice matter pending before the Indian courts. Now, the third case which I was referring, this is State Bank of India versus SCL Manufacturing Company Limited. In this case, this matter was pending before NCLT Chandigarh and US Bankruptcy Court in Delaware. They recognized the pending proceedings in India as the foreign main proceedings under the Indian code. So this is, I don't think we have had any additional cases where Indian court orders have been recognized outside India. Now, briefly to touch upon the intersection of arbitration and cross-border insolvency. Now, why is this important? First, let's understand that. So under the code, under section 14, once an IBC is admitted, there is a moratorium which bars litigation, pending arbitration, fresh arbitration. There are limited exceptions decided by the courts, like for example, the Delhi High Court's decision in Power Grid and various other NCLAT decisions where limited exceptions have been given to continue with the proceedings. But in all of these proceedings, the litigation was to benefit the corporate debtor. So suffice to say that once the IBC process is admitted, you can't do anything with the arbitration. It gets stalled. Now, the reason this is important is if this is an India-seated arbitration, of course, the Indian tribunal would look at the Section 14 order and suspend the proceedings. And the parties, frankly, would have no recourse. Yes, possibly they can participate in the CIRP process. Their claims may be accepted, may not be accepted. If accepted, they may have to settle for 10%, 5%. If not accepted, SR judgment has clarified that you can't help it. In the event then a new management comes, even then you can't help it, because typically there would be a clause which will say that all pending litigations and arbitration will stand extinguished upon the new management coming into the place. So you are helpless, basically. The situation is slightly different in the foreign context, in a foreign seated arbitration. And I'll give an example. Supposing there are two parties and the Indian parties the IBC process has been initiated against the Indian party, and the foreign counterpart, say in Singapore, they have a London-seated arbitration. Increasingly, a lot of foreign-seated tribunals are taking the view that because insolvency proceedings have been initiated in India, that would not bar them from commencing or from continuing with the arbitral proceedings, because there is no reciprocity. Now, theoretically, I mean, that is fine, so long as the foreign party is able to enforce the arbitral award against the Indian party if they have assets outside India. In the event they have to come to India to enforce the award, that may not be enforceable under Section 48, because that would be in contravention to the insolvency code. And if there's a derogation of the substantive law, that would give enough ground to sort of refuse or resist enforcement of the foreign award. So these are the nuances which are there, which we don't have any answers. We are still grappling while a lot of our arbitrations get stalled. Sometimes, I mean, we try to act smart. We advise our clients to sort of structure it to see, like, for example, if this is a foreign-seated arbitration, a lot of people I know, I mean, they are continuing with the arbitration with the hope that they can enforce it outside India. If it is in India, then of course, nothing can be done. These are the nuances that we have. I think a cross-border mechanism, if it is properly stipulated, with it will give much clarity and certainty to the entire process, and would help a lot of litigants to strategize, or sometimes they have good settlement offers, right? Knowing if there is certainty, they can sit on the table and decide whether to settle or take fight it for another 2 or 3 years. So with this, I'll conclude, and I'm happy to answer any questions or any feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alipak. That was a very useful session where you spoke about not only the UNCITRAL model law, but also the interface with arbitration. And also, I think, thank you so much for pointing out this Delaware judgment as well, which I think is not talked about as much, but is a very interesting case. So I will now, I think we will have time at the end for questions from all the panelists. I think so. I will move now to Sudeep to talk about, changing gears a little bit, to talk about the pre-pack process. Perhaps you can talk a little bit, Sudeep, about what is a pre-pack itself, and then maybe the latest report on pre-packs and your views on this. Thank you so much. Over to you, Sudeep.
Sure. Thanks, Aparna. It's always hard to come and bat at number three when the first two batsmen have done such a great job. But let me try and, match Chandiok sir and Alipa, who I thought were brilliant with their parts. If you look at IBC, in terms of protecting business value, I was involved with the SR Steel matter. It took 886 days for that matter to close from the date on CRP started to the date on which ArcelorMittal Nippon Steel took over. But having said that, the underlying business continued to function well in CRP. The steel plant was running, the steel was getting produced, people were buying the steel. So the business value did not get it. And to the extent that you see companies which are going through CRP where there is a physical asset, a plant, infrastructure asset. So even if the process takes long, you don't really see the underlying business value sort of going down. But if you take, and we've sort of talked about Jet, the insolvency in the cross-border situation, but if you look at Jet as a company, the minute it went into insolvency, there was uncertainty, and people then were like, "Well, should I book my next flight on Jet? I don't know if the plane will take off. So maybe I should not go on a jet. I should take an Indigo Vistara." So suddenly people stopped taking jet flights. A lot of their aircrafts were leased. So the lessors will say, "Well, we need to take the aircrafts back because we don't want to be stuck in some Indian insolvency proceeding somewhere." The crew, the pilots, who started looking for jobs. Eventually, what happened was that the airline got grounded. And then, because these slots at most of our airports are pretty much in demand, you end up in a situation the slots are given away to other airlines. And then, by the time you have bidders coming in and looking at this company, there's not really much value left. We were advising our international client, and the first question this client asked, who owns several airlines around the world, was, "Well, are we going to get the slots back if we were to put in a bid?" And frankly, there was no assurance that you would get the slots back. And without the slots at the airports in Bombay is, I think, the single among the busiest airports in the world. So if you don't get slots, then the company itself doesn't have significant value. So CRP, the way it is currently set up, does well for companies where a lot of the business value is in physical assets, which doesn't get affected too much, even if the process runs for longer, even if there's uncertainty, because the asset continues to function. But where you have a business value coming from brand, from consumers, from employees, the uncertainty and the delays that we have in CIRP could lead to the business value getting depleted quite quickly once the CIRP is initiated. So then the idea is that, well, is an alternative which can work faster, which still gives you all the protections, right? Any kind of restructuring, insolvency resolution, you would still need some of the protections that IBC gives as a RA coming in, that past liabilities are gone, the debt is restructured. But at the same time, A, it is faster, and B, there's more certainty that the date the company is going into CIRP, you kind of know that this is one possible outcome. So, your ticket money is safe, if it's a IT company, or your job is safe, nothing is happening to it. So the certainty and speed is something that might work well for a lot of businesses, and which is where pre-pack insolvency is coming. Globally, pre-pack insolvency is a broad term which sort of describes two processes. One is pre-pack sales, especially in UK. This is quite prevalent, where essentially what happens is that a company comes, negotiates, and identifies one or more bidders, and who are going to buy all its assets. And then it appoints an administrator who, often in a matter of few hours, can conclude the sale and transfer the assets to these pre-identified bidders. This is a pre-pack sale process. Then the other process is a pre-pack insolvency. In the United States, they have pre-pack sales, but they also have pre-pack, restructurings, either under Chapter 11 or outside of it. They have two options, but that's similar to what we try to attempt, at least in the first go, which is actually restructuring of the debts and of the corporate debtor, and sort of ensuring that it turns around and revives. So many jurisdictions have pre-pack solutions, where essentially the company in question sort of negotiates with its existing creditors, comes up with a package saying this is how the debt is going to be restructured, this is how we are going to look like, and then sort of does a very fast track insolvency process. US, there have been some examples where it has got done within a matter of days, which means you go into insolvency pretty quickly, you come out of it, and you're done. And so the business value, your brand value, is all protected. And I think, given that we now have the ecosystem, right? We have the professionals, we have the experience with CIRP. I think it is felt that it is time now to look at pre-pack insolvency as the next evolutionary step in Indian insolvency. The government set up this subcommittee of insolvency law committee to look at pre-pack. And let me just sort of look at that report, because the report is quite interesting in the terms of the choices that it makes, and to set out a sort of a framework which it proposes, and let's see where it goes. The first choice it sort of made was between pre-pack sales and pre-pack, insolvency proceedings. Given that our IBC jurisprudence is focused on revival and value maximization and sort of taking care of stakeholders, is not supposed to be a sale process. I think NCLAT had that as an observation also in the Binani matter. So the path that they are recommending that we follow is pre-pack restructuring as opposed to pre-pack sale. So it's not like you agree to the sale of the assets. They are looking at a way in which the company can be revived and turned around through the pre-pack process. So that was the first sort of choice that they are recommending, which is consistent with what generally is also set out in our IBC and jurisprudence over the last 3-4 years. The process that they sort of talk about is that only the corporate debtor would be allowed to initiate pre-pack for now. That is the recommendation, because again, the corporate debtor is obviously best placed to take a call on whether a pre-pack is possible, it is feasible. Before admission into before getting into the NCLT, there are 3 steps that it needs to happen. One, the board needs to take a decision. Then the suggestion is to go to the shareholders to seek shareholder approval. After shareholders, then go to the creditors, which is the financial creditors by simple majority should approve the process. Once that has happened, then you can go to the NCLT and say, look, this is we want to go into a pre-pack insolvency resolution. The NCLT sort of approves that. RP is appointed, who then calls for a resolution plan, which the COC looks at. The COC can call for a Swiss challenge, that's the proposal. Or if it is, in certain circumstances, can directly go and submit the plan to the adjudicating authority. And the final step is the NCLT approves this. The Obviously, the timelines that they are prescribing before you get to the NCLT stage itself, you need shareholder approval, COC approval. After you get into NCLT, they suggest 90 days for a resolution plan to be finalized and submitted, and then 30 days for the NCLT to approve it. It sounds like a 150, 160-day plus process. My initial reaction, and I'll be happy to sort of get the views of the entire panel, but 160 days doesn't sound very, different from what we are talking about. If the CIRP model timelines were to be followed, I don't think there's a huge difference. So, I mean, timing is one thing that, at least when I was reading the report of the committee, I was not 100% sure that it really gets you to the, because the committee itself talks about how it gets resolved fast in many countries within days, hours, it can be done. But the timeline they eventually end up proposing, and I guess they're trying to marry the existing IBC concepts to pre-pack is again a 150-day, 160-day timeline. So that is one thing that I think will have to be debated a little more. The other, in globally, pre-packs are led by corporate debtors, right? And the existing management, existing shareholders, they have the greatest economic incentive to sort of revive the company. They're the closest to the company, and they kind of do it. In India, of course, we have Section 29A, which bars promoters in a lot of scenarios to participate in the process. Now that obviously creates and Chandyok sir rightly pointed out that this creates an issue with pre-pack insolvencies. The committee itself was divided. There was a minority opinion which said that, look, why don't you, given the inherent nature of pre-pack, make an exception, let the promoters come in and participate. Maybe the way to do it is that if the NPAs are with respect to this corporate debtor, then you can participate. If it's with respect to any other corporate debtor, then you should not be allowed to participate in the pre-pack process. The majority view was that no, 29A should be maintained as is. And ultimately, I think that was the recommendation. But that creates the problem that why would a corporate debtor then really take all the effort to sort of go through a pre-pack process if the promoters and the existing management are not allowed to participate? And that might be a big issue. The third thing, with pre-packs globally, there's a certain amount of confidentiality that you could potentially have in the process. You could keep it a very sort of limited, and this has been criticized because on the flip side, then that means there's not enough information going out. There are not enough bidders who are participating if you're limiting the sort of marketing of the pre-pack process. In the Indian context, obviously they're talking about a shareholders approval, then a COC approval. So so it will be a fairly public process. So then you have to inherently think about that. Well, the minute I start getting a shareholder approval that, look, I'm going through a potential restructuring thing, then would the concerns around CIRP start coming into play? Would people say, well, will my flights take off? Will my phone get serviced? People keep talking about telecom bankruptcies all the time. So, then the minute you start that shareholder approval process, would that then effectively lead to the same situation that initiation of CIRP would lead? So those are some 3-4 issues. I think the report makes progress in setting out a framework, but ultimately I think we'll have to still see whether what we end up is actually a pre-pack, or it's maybe just a slightly lighter version of existing CIRP, but that may not get you all the way. The last 2 things to just talk about is the implementation. Again, the committee is sort of suggesting a phased implementation, where the first phase will be COVID-related deaths, which were excluded due to the moratorium, and the second would be defaults ranging between 1 lakh to 1 crore. That's phase 1. and then it sort of gradually, other phases are. Again, I'm not sure whether that phased-wise implementation is the correct approach, or should we just be doing it for across the board. And finally, I think it talks about they are focused on one of the things that globally PPAC has been criticized as just information. So there is this whole concept of an information memorandum to be prepared by the corporate debtor and given to the resolution professionals, for which, if there are mistakes, then the CD has liability. They're also talking about having 2 valuation reports which are available. So they're trying to bridge that gap in terms of information in the pre-pack process, which, like I said, is a criticism of pre-pack processes around the world. So I think that is the general sort of a summary of what we see in the report. Now let's see what finally sort of comes out in the days going forward.
Thank you so much, Sudeep. That was a really concise and comprehensive account, I think, of the pre-pack process. And I think there were lots of interesting points that we got out from the report itself. One, of course, is the conflict between the student. Sorry, am I audible or is my...
Yes.
Yes. I felt an echo. So one, of course, is, this distinction between pre-pack sale and pre-pack resolution, and how the committee has said in its report that very clearly that, this is going to be like a pre-pack resolution process. The other, of course, is all the conflicting views around Section 29A, and I too have similar doubts as to how much the pre-packs would actually be used if there was no relaxation to, especially to 29AC around, having NPAs for more than a year. So that's one issue. And then the last thing that you also talked about that I think is interesting is that pre-packs seem to be balancing, the advantages of certainty, speed, a much shorter process, with the need for some transparency and information flow. And I think that was also something we could see from the pre-pack report as well, and you rightly said that the process was going on for longer than there are cases where pre-packs in the US, for example, are done in a week or a couple of weeks at the most. So lots of interesting issues. Before we go to the student presentation, I just wanted to see if there were any quick reactions from the panelists. Chandyokji, do you have any specific points either on pre-pack or on what Alipak was talking about in terms of arbitration and IBC?
You see, my view is that no law is perfect. No law. And my worry is what my friend Mapatra has said. I am worried about it, that supposing I, as a corporate debtor, in fact, my view on 29A has all through been that you should not allow everybody by one stroke of brush to go out. Yes, there may be people who have intentionally done something siphoning or some offenses which in the state law, I feel that he has done something which calls for a larger. But if there's a decision, now look at technology. I mean, we have just talked about, as I think Steve rightly said, that there are assets and the assets are going on. But if I'm a technology would become obsolete. There'll be nothing. So where am I taking such resolutions? We're not doing anything for that reason. I need to look at that part. And my worry is that if you do not allow corporate debtor to come in, first of all, as he rightly said, there'll be hardly a starter to it. The second part is more important than the first to my mind. Because if I prepare as a corporate debtor, as an existing promoter, a memorandum of information, then you'll use that tomorrow. Then tomorrow when Alipak files a Section 7 petition and I want to oppose it, you will say you yourself made that. Look at your information. No, these are issues that we need to look at right in the beginning. Because if you are going to use my material against me in ultimately CIRP process, then what for should I do that effort? Because obviously I am going to prepare a memorandum of information as a corporate debtor. I am going to do everything. And why, first of all, as I think rightly he said, why would I do it if ultimately God knows what is going to happen? And those places where things have happened in a week because people take decisions right there. Here a COC man will say, I'll have to go back to my board and check. Especially when he's doing it outside the court, he says, no, I don't have an authorization to scale it down to 40. I have only till 50. So I'll have to go back to my board, which board will meet and probably take another 2 months. Now, I agree there's a scenario in India where we are in difficulty. Therefore, we need to bring our financial institutions also in tune with the present system. We can't keep them as the dead wood, what we are looking at, and every few years we induct finances into it or capital into it and say, okay, now you revive. Therefore, these are issues which will crop up and will crop up 100%. Therefore, my only thing is, and I think Alipak, for example, in the arbitration said that we have not recognized 49 countries only. Now, if you are talking about globe as a village, then why are we not doing it? We should recognize more, unless there is some enemy you probably feel. I don't think I have notified any country as an enemy. We may talk anybody. I have not even notified China or Pakistan as an enemy country. And I strongly feel, that's nothing to do with IBC, that if India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and all of us were to join together as one, why do I need a BRIC country to go to Brazil and go to South Africa? I'll be a force to be reckoned with. We have not done that. We need to look at that part first, because ultimately it is one India. Therefore, these are issues that we need to look at it first of all. These are primary issues that we need to look at. Though, of course, I understand there's a political scenario behind it. But as lawyers are we talking? We're talking as professionals. If professionally we are looking at today, I can give that information as a BRIC legal forum, that we are today looking at a arbitration and mediation rules which will be applicable to all 5 countries, including China. Then obviously there will be recognition, which is like any other recognition of cross-border. So why don't we bring those principles? Maybe you start making those principles. If not, you think we can't have a legislation in pre-pack. Also, to my mind, why don't you give an example? Put them through. What prevents me to go to NCLT and say I have a settled?
Absolutely.
Please give me it's like a judicial settlement. The 5 words used in CPC section 89 is mediation 1, conciliation 3rd, judicial settlement. So that's a different concept altogether. It's nothing to do with conciliation. It's nothing to do with mediation. Alipak will tell us better that in the arbitration, many people feel that section 30 says mediation, conciliation, it also means arbitrator can do it. I don't think so. He can send it to another expert, yes, to do that mediation. Possible. If he's going to mediate, then the whole confidentiality, everything will go. Therefore, we need to clarify this position at every level today. And once we clarify that position, we should look at aim. If the aim is to, in the pre-pack, to bring home a resolution faster rather than calling all those valuations, everything, then why are they will have valuations with them, the committee of creditors in any case. Now they've unified their system. If I go over one loan, everybody knows the same person is going to give him the report. Then why does he need it? He will have his last report. Why can't we rely upon that? Unless there is a change. Yes, I understand. Therefore, to bring a system faster, we'll have to build confidence. The confidence is today missing. And if there's no confidence in the corporate debtor by the financial institutions, I don't think there's a beginning to pre-pack.
No, that is a very interesting point, actually, I think, on this.
Because if I don't have confidence in him, why would I do a pre-pack even if he brings a pre-pack which is worth looking at? I will say, sorry, I don't have confidence in you, Mr. Studio.
Absolutely. No,
so that's the problem. So first question is, how do I bring that confidence back? Therefore, I said you'll have to make an exception for corporate debtors who have committed crimes. Yes, please take them away. But let people come back. I could be a startup who has taken a wrong decision. No, wrong judgment is not a... Then you don't throw out judges because he's given a wrong judgment and Supreme Court certifies it or the High Court certifies it. You don't throw them out. It's
Thank you.
just judicial dispensation. So please make a distinction in law for people who are otherwise committed crimes. Yes, take them away. Don't give them an opportunity, at least till they're done with their punishments or whatever they are. But at least those people who have genuinely as a judgment position, especially in those startups, how will you do it? The
Absolutely.
smaller companies where you just take a wrong decision, you should have gone with asking Alipak to advise you, but no, you went to Mr. Chandiok who advised you wrongly. So what do? It's a bona fide decision.
Yes. No, thank you so much. No, that's
Thank you.
very true. Alipak, any quick reactions?
No, I think I've nothing to add to what Sudeep has very helpfully set out. Only one point which is not absolutely linked to this topic, but this is something which has been I have been. So what is happening is now a lot of foreign investors, when they get into a dispute against the promoters, and last 2 years I've had at least 5 or 6 arbitrations which have been stalled. uh, After CIRP gets initiated, basically they're helpless. Now they can't participate in the CIRP. I mean, the RP most likely would reject their claim because the underlying contract. I mean, they may not. They will obviously not be a financial creditor, operational creditor anyway. They may not get more than 2 cents to a dollar. Now the SR judgment has clarified that all the pending litigation and arbitration will stand extinguished. So what do they do? These are, I'm talking of claims which could be 1,000 crores, 1,500 crores. What will they do? Just because you want to revive a company, someone may have a bona fide claim of such a huge sum of money, which you had promised that you will pay back as per IRR or 15%, 20%. Forget about IRR, some return. These are money which are just absolutely gone. And I understand the sentiment of reviving the corporate data. I completely appreciate. Maybe we need to do a lot of discussion on this and think that what is the right balance, and talk about it and try and see how we can tweak it. So this is a problem which I feel, which I've been thinking in the last 6 to 7 months. There should be some solution on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually speaking, only to give you one sentence, Alipak, that you are actually, by reviving a company, making 10 others insolvent.
I think the
Especially in relation to operational creditors. Please consider it. Because unless you bring something, as you're rightly saying, to balance the two situations, you may be lending somebody else into insolvency. So there should be a residual part in a resolution plan compulsory by a statute to say these things you will cater for to the what extent. Yes, I understand.
Yes.
You're right. You may cap it. That even if my claim is 100 crores, I will probably get only 20 crores. Possible. But I must get something. You stall my judicial process. And of course, I am not arguing against it. It actually amounts to contrary to access to justice, first principle of Constitution. But then it's the part of the statute upheld by the Supreme Court. Now I can't say anything about it. But having said that, but I still feel in order to look at economic laws, you must look at everybody, every stakeholder who is part of that industry. Don't leave them out high and dry. As I said, you will then land up, some of them will probably go into insolvencies. There's no purpose making a resolution plan for A and company and making 3 others go to insolvency. Thank you.
Thank you so much. No, I think that's a very, slightly different topic, but I think it is a very interesting point. And I think especially the whole SR Steel judgment was very clear on operational creditors were really, something that we'll have to look at, because Chandiokji, you're absolutely right that could actually, insolvency of one entity could lead to operational creditors going insolvent themselves in this scenario. Sudeep, any very quick comments? I'm conscious of time as well, and to give some time for this.
No, sure. I think Chandiok sir made an interesting point that ultimately, as far as this one is concerned, a feedback, you need to have the confidence between creditors and corporate debtors. And unless that gets revived, I don't think we will, the feedback will really take off. So that is one important point. Just on the other point on group enterprise, right? So the one we don't talk about often in terms of group enterprise resolution is ILNFS. It's not an IBC process, it's obviously under the Companies Act. But I think it's a very good illustration of how complicated certain insolvency resolutions are. And if you try to resolve ILNFS, company by company, SPV by SPV, it would probably take decades to resolve. So I think these are the classic situations where you do need a group resolution framework. Of course, there the government created a whole different mechanism, which heavily borrows from the IBC, I might add. But so ILNFS situations are situations which really demonstrate why we need group insolvency resolution, because trying to do them on a piecemeal basis would probably never work. So just wanted to highlight that, as an example.
Thank you so much. I think we've taken up quite a bit of time. I will turn it over now to the Daksha Fellows for the student presentation. And then after that, I think there will be some time so if everyone can stay on, we can take some questions as well.
Thank you, ma'am. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
Respected panelists, moderator, all the faculty at Daksha, my dear fellows, and all the participants who have joined us online, a very good morning to all. Our presentation will be dealing with cross-border insolvency and its tryst with India. At the very forefront, I would like to thank my team members without whom this presentation wouldn't have been possible. Anushka, Narjis, and Sneha. And I also would like to thank faculty members who have helped us in preparing this presentation, Professor Chitra Narayan, Professor Mahesh Menon, and Professor Siddharth Vedula. Like Mr. Mahapatra rightly pointed out that it's very hard to go at number 3, I hope he'll agree that it's even harder to go at number 4. So we'll try to keep this presentation short, and I apologize if I know we'll reiterating more stuff, because it's quite inevitable after such a delightful and erudite session by the panelists. So I'll quickly go through the trajectory that we have seen so far in the space of cross-border insolvency. Now, it's important to analyze as in how things have come up, and how world actually approached towards cross-border insolvency. So up until 1940s, the world was governed by the Adam Smith's model of laissez-faire. It was only after the 3 events of Great Economic Depression, the World War I and the World War II, did the world realize that this model will not last for long. Now, thereafter, from 1940s onwards up till 1980s, we saw the rise of the Keynesian model, which had a touch of Soviet socialism, where state played the major role, and it was controlling the key sectors, what Lenin actually remarked as commanding heights. Now, after the 1960s, as pointed out by Dr. Prabhash in the yesterday's session on BITs, that from 1980s onwards, there was the oil crisis, 1960s, 1970s. We realized that we had to move to a market-based model where we are regulating the markets and through regulators. So then came the era of globalization. India also went through the LPG reforms in 1991 after seeing its BOP crisis, and we realized that our import substitution will not last for long. Now, with this globalization also came the bilateral investment treaties. So we were seeing the inflow of foreign investments. We were seeing the businesses were no longer just restricted to the domestic territories. They were leaving behind the global footprints. Now, in this setting, the global leaders approached, because the earlier events that I pointed out, I had kind of made them more skeptical about this model. So they wanted to ensure that this model stays stable and for long. We saw different organizations, different treaties being formed out. One was UNCITRAL, the United Nations Convention on International Trade Law. and under it was the model law on cross-border insolvency. As Mr. Chindyok also pointed out, that this model was just a guide, because the idea was to allow states to be more flexible adopting this model. It was a departure from the earlier territorialist and the universalist approach. And it was a hybrid model this time that Mr. Banerjee also pointed out, that was based on the 4 principles of access, recognition, cooperation, coordination, and relief. So I'll not be going into detail. I think Mr. Banerjee has more or less covered everything on the foreign main parties, foreign non-main parties, and the COMEA as well. Now, quickly moving on to the Indian context. Now we see from 2000 onwards, so India actually was one of the founding members of UNCITRAL. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. However, it did not adopt it in its own laws. So this was also being pointed out by the Iradi committee, Professor Mitra committee, and JJ Irani committee, as in that we need to have an insolvency regime in India, and definitely one on the cross-border insolvency. However, when we approached, let me take a moment to reflect what would have been a situation in 2008 crisis had India faced a situation similar to US. Now imagine we do not have a law dealing with cross-border insolvency, neither do we have a law dealing with insolvency. And imagine an entity as big as Lehman Brothers, which had presence in more than 50 countries, and had it gone through an insolvency in India, how would have been the situation? So it took almost 2 decades, and yet also we are not there. We are just ready with this draft. The better side is that we now see the light towards the other side of the tunnel. Then came the BLRC, of which our respected moderator was also a member of. And the BLRC, allow me to criticize softly on this, ma'am. Why the BRC should be credited for what we have as IBC today. However, it still missed out on the point whether we should go in for the cross-border insolvency or not, which was strongly objected and pointed by the Joint Parliamentary Committee and the parliamentarians in the debates. Then incorporated, based on that, were the 2 sections in IBC 234 and 235, which Mr. Banerjee have already pointed out. I'll not go into detail on that in the interest of time. Now, the brunt was being borne by the Indian business entities, which actually went in for the initial phase of insolvency, as Mr. Chindyok pointed out, that there were 12 entities, one being Amtech. So it filed for the corporate insolvency resolution in 2017. And it's very sad to say that it is yet to come to a resolution, though it's pending before the Chandigarh bench. It's hopefully going to be resolved this year. Now, the idea was that this entity was one of the largest players in automobile parts, had definitely had a good global presence because it has different subsidiaries, and it was acquiring more and more players in this market. However, when it went into this liquidation, the cross-border, CIRP, things went pretty bad. So one idea of IBC was to have the value maximization of assets. However, we ended up reducing more than 70% of its value. Now, quickly going on to the Insolvency Law Committee that was formed under the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. It recommended to include the model law under IBC in 2018, based on which we now have the draft ready. In 2019 came the Jet Airways case that I will be talking about, though Mr. Banerjee has more or less covered everything, but I'll take the liberty to discuss a few aspects on this. Okay, so the screen is showing me that we have gone too far with this artistic presentations. So NCA, the issue before the, so I'll go the very starting only. The facts are very simple that the insolvency proceeding was initiated before the Dutch district courts because Jet has defaulted on 2 European creditors. The liquidation proceeding actually was initiated, and the Dutch administrator was appointed, or what we call the trustees, just like we have RPs here. Now, simultaneously, a parallel proceeding was started in India before the Mumbai bench. And and of course the administrator approaches Ministry of Corporate Affairs and NCLT and talks about that we need the access to the financials and the assets of JET, to which the NCLT gave a very regressive ruling. It said that you do not have the jurisdiction on that because we are still being governed by the territorialist approach, and it is IBC that will take care of the insolvency resolution process. Now, very interestingly, if you see the initial phase of IBC, you'll realize that it was the Supreme Court that went as a leader ahead and shows the way to how we have to interpret the IBC. It was NCLAT this time that gave the progressive ruling that no, I think we have to find a way out, and they actually adopted, though we were not yet close to the draft based on the model law. They adopted the principles based on the model law. So they gave access, they allowed the intervention of the Dutch administrator. They convinced the RP to find a workable solution with the Dutch administrator, also made the party to COC, though he was not allowed to vote on that. And the administrator was also directed to not sell any assets, any foreign assets, or make any third-party claims in that. Now, the idea essentially is that the NCLAT's approach on adopting the insolvency protocol, where the Dutch administrator and the Dutch administrator and the resolution professional. Thank you, Sneha. Resolution professional would come together and find a workable solution and look for an agreement where we take claims of all the foreign creditors, operational creditors, and all the financial creditors. Now, quickly moving on to this map, it shows the global diffusion. So the idea of global diffusion has been taken from David Levy-Faure's idea of the diffusion of regulatory capitalism. So you can see on the map, so these are the major players. As of today, we have 49 states that have adopted the model law in their national insolvency laws. So the initial players were USA, UK, of course. USA now has the Chapter 15 dealing with the insolvency, cross-border insolvency. We have 2 players added in 2020 only. That was Brazil and Myanmar. Now, India is still to appear on that. That's something that we are very looking forward to. And so these are the major trading partners of India. So what happens if India adopts this law? So India will send a very strong signal that we are a very progressive and a very forward-looking market, and will definitely reflect on the ease of doing business, because it's kind of a welcoming sign for all the foreign direct investments and the businesses. So very quickly, moving forward, I'll hand it over to Sneha. She'll take the presentation forward.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Abhishek. Good morning to all. So now I'll be dealing with the analysis of the Indian position in the cross-border insolvency. More or less, this was covered by Aparna ma'am and Alipak sir. But I'll try to add the points which were not already covered. So yeah, as Aparna ma'am has already covered, there will be 3 situations of this in any cross-border insolvency process. So now I'll be analyzing the position of India in these 3 situations by drawing the reference from the existing legal framework, judicial precedents, and the draft law on the cross-border insolvency. So in the first situation, as already the Alipak sir has mentioned about Section 235, so we have a provision in the IBC of Section 235. So I'm not going to deal with that in the interest of time. So while coming to the draft law has provided for the adoption of the model law relating to the guidelines for the communication, cooperation, and coordination between the courts in the cross-border insolvency matters, which aims to provide the sharing of the information between the different jurisdictions to save costs, and also to help the identification, preservation, and the maximization of the assets of the debtor's value. So this is the extra provision which was provided in the UNCITRAL model and which the draft law has recognized to adopt in our IBC proceedings even. So as already Alipak sir has talked about the legislative reciprocity and how it would be not that great in the interest what we have seen in the New York Convention of Arbitration and all those things. So the reciprocity agreements will not help in this situation. But however, unfortunately, this draft committee has suggested for the legislative reciprocity even. So while coming to the second situation, in the second situation, the IBC was completely silent and did not provide any remedy. However, the appellate tribunal has laid the precedent through a Jet Airways case, which Abhishek has already dealt with. So, and while coming to the draft law has provided for the provision of the access to the Indian courts for the foreign creditors and the foreign representatives. And moreover, I would like to emphasize on the Supreme Court's decision in Macquarie Bank, in which it has provided foreign creditors to easily access the Indian courts by providing the liberal interpretation of the term financial institutions. So this is clear that the Indian stance of the judiciary that the foreign creditors are not discriminated in the cross-border insolvency. While in the third situation, there are concurrent, the draft law has provided for the concurrent and joint hearings so that the both parties who are interested can have concurrent and joint hearings. And as Alipak sir has already emphasized on the foreign proceedings like foreign main and foreign non-main, I would not delve more into it. So I would just like to hand over the mic to Abhishek to conclude this.
Thank you, Sneha. So I'd like to conclude by saying that we have a standing committee on finance, its sixth report, it's coming up with the insolvency and bankruptcy second amendment bill. So it is proposed to introduce the draft bill on cross-border insolvency. We hope that it comes as soon as possible. The code is a very transformational piece. It has definitely proved its mettle, and though it's still at the right nascent stage, but it has, delivered in a rightful manner. As the process matures, after the draft bill gets incorporated under the code, and of course, after the recommendations of the committee that's formed for the rules and regulations framing for the cross-border insolvency, of which a respected moderator is a member of, we expect that it will have a good impact on the, as I mentioned, on the ease of doing business and definitely on the economic growth of India. So this is considering the time that we're living in post-COVID. We're expecting more than a few cross-border insolvency petitions at the doorstep of NCLT. As very rightly pointed out by Mr. Chandok, that every code goes through an evolution, every law goes through an evolution. So this is an evolution of the IBC, and I think it has been remarkable so far. I think it is the only legislation that has come closer to the IT Act, Income Tax Act, that has shown such remarkable evolution. Definitely the impressive performance of the RPs of the informational utilities and the adjudicating authority is praiseworthy. And definitely it's worth the Singapore Award of the finest legislation. We have no doubts on that. So we're really looking forward to the new reforms that are going to come in this field. One being the cross-group insolvency. The others are the cross-border insolvency in respect of individuals and partners. And definitely one being the pre-packs, as Mr. Mahapatra talked about. Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience and time. Thank you. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much, Abhishek and Sneha. That was an excellent presentation. I think really gets all the concepts here very clearly. I think we have a few minutes for questions, and I would like to open it to the audience for any questions. There is one question on the chat box, which is quite interesting, that I also wanted to raise, which talks about how even in the context, even if there were a cross-border insolvency, it may not be enough, it says, for the foreign creditors to obtain an arbitral award or a judgment against an Indian debtor. They will still have to convince the RBI that the payment under the award or judgment is permitted as a permitted foreign exchange remittance, and have the panelists dealt with this aspect. And I think this is important. This is also something that's going to come up in the context of implementing the cross-border insolvency provisions. How does that interface with the various FEMA restrictions? So That's one question. Alipak, did you have any specific, or any other panelists, do you have any specific views on that?
Sure. So there are two cases. I can talk about one. The other one I'm conflicted because I'm a respondent. I'm representing the respondent, so I will not be able to share much detail. But you see, people have gone about structuring this. Like, let me talk about the Tata Docomo arbitration award, right? That the underlying agreement, it had a assured return clause. And firstly, let me clarify: this is an issue which is not only specific to cross-border insolvency. It happens in general enforcement of arbitration. It's a very generic issue to that extent. Now let's look at what happened in Tata Docomo, right? There was an assured return clause. A London City tribunal, they they awarded the sum as a way of damages, uh, by way of damages. So which is why when Delhi High Court, in an enforcement petition, when Delhi High Court was looking at it, arguments were of course raised by the Tatas that this is an assured return. It can't be, you can't enforce this award. In fact, RBI also intervened in the case. Delhi High Court, they took the view that one, this is by way of damages. This is not an assured return. Number two, even if it were to be a short return, by that, in the strictly under the Arbitration Act, it would not nullify the enforcement. There may be issues under the FEMA and in particular pricing guidelines. That is an issue for RBI to decide. Now, after that, it would have been a very interesting discussion, but then the matter settled. So we have not gone beyond that. Now, in March 2020, similar issue was raised in a Supreme Court case, Prismian versus Vijay Karya, and this is a case I'm because I represented the respondent. We had argued that that of course the award talks about the assured return. This was a case which said that if there was a breach, you would pay 10% above the market value. So this was an assured return clause based on which the award came in. So can't be enforced. Justice Nariman said that, look, this ipso facto will not nullify the arbitral award. Yes, there may be issues about the exchange regulations, but that's for RBI to decide. After that, what has happened, of course, I'm conflicted, so I'll not share any light, but I don't think beyond these two cases, we have had any issues on this aspect. And this is a very interesting area. Hopefully there will be students in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Sudip, did you have any?
Sure. No, just to supplement, the one distinction, obviously, I think what Alipak was mentioning, and this insolvency scenario is that in Tata Docomo, it was against RBI regulations to offer an assured return. It is not against RBI's regulation for you to claim money from an Indian party who's defaulted on a debt. So at a very fundamental level, if you were to go to RBI and say, look, we've got this judgment, we want to remit the money, and until then the money is parked in a court account or in an escrow, I think RBI would be sympathetic to it. This is not somewhere where Indian foreign exchange regulations have an inherent problem with you remitting money. So one, approval may be possible. And to the extent that you don't get an approval, you have, I think, good grounds to then go back to court and say, give us an order allowing this remittance. Remittances in these sort of situations, I think, obviously, like Alipak said, there is already the whole background to Tata Docomo, but even beyond that, this is not fundamentally contradictory to the regulatory regime under FEMA. It's a question of getting approval because that payment is not contemplated, which is a bit different from, say, doing something which is really sort of restricted or prohibited under FEMA.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any other questions from the attendees or the other Daksha fellows?
Ma'am, may I ask a question?
Yes, of course. Please go ahead.
Ma'am, my question is directed to you. Since you've been the part of the BLRC when we did not adopt the cross-border insolvency, the in detailed provisions, and now you're the part of the committee that's framing the rules and regulations on the, the cross-border insolvency so that it kind of transitions in a smooth fashion. How do you see the change, or what change in the transition do you see in the approach while working on BLRC and now on the Committee on Framing of Rules and Regulations?
Okay, so on that, I think the BLRC was very conscious that cross-border insolvency had to be dealt with at some point in time. I think the main reason that it wasn't dealt with in that report, and I was one of many committee members there, so I can't speak for everyone, was just because they felt that we need to tackle one issue at a time. First, get the domestic legislative framework set up before going to cross-border insolvency. And of course, that is debatable, but they felt that you needed a certain level of maturity, certain familiarity of all the stakeholders and the infrastructure with the legislation before going to the next stage of cross-border insolvency. I think in terms of after that, of course, there was the Insolvency Law Committee that looked into cross-border insolvency and also recommended adopting, I think it was part of Part Z of the IBC. They even provided a framework for adopting the UNCITRAL model law. That hasn't been adopted so far, and for probably many reasons, but I think this committee that I am currently sitting on, which actually on the cross-border part, the report hasn't been made public, but that work is done. We were primarily looking at how to ensure that, in the Indian context and specifically in the context of the IBC, what are the rules and regulations required for a smooth implementation of cross-border provisions? And some of these include points that have been brought up in the panel today. I think Mr. Chandyok had brought up this issue of foreign lawyers. Can they practice here? And then what would be the role? The other issue that comes up quite a lot is if foreign representatives were allowed to appear before tribunals here or were allowed to participate here, then would they have to be subject to any regulation? So those were the kinds of more nitty-gritties in the rules that this committee was looking at. I mean, I don't know if there's any specific change in approach per se, but more that, it's an evolution of the law, and we do believe that the time has come definitely now to implement cross-border principles.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Welcome. Any other questions? Okay. We've actually managed to finish on time, which I think is a great achievement. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I think this has been a fantastic session. I certainly learned a lot from today's session, and thank you also to Sai University and the Daksha Fellowship for organizing this. Over to you.
Thank you very much, all of you, Chandyok, Alipok, Aparna, and Sudeep, for taking time out on a Saturday from your busy professional lives to attend this panel discussion and to speak to our students. I'm sure all of us enjoyed it, and it's been an enlightening session. And I think we've identified some disagreements. We've also identified issues that probably require more time to thrash out. And we hope that we can host you sometime soon again for a more detailed exposition of these issues. Thank you very much. We look forward to hosting all of you again. Thank you.
Thank you for having us over. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aparna.